Ever make a decision and then think, wait a minute, what was I basing that on?
Happens to the best of us.
Yeah, I think we've all fallen prey to those sneaky mental shortcuts that our brains love to take.
Absolutely.
And in this deep dive, we're going to be unpacking chapters 9 through 13
Okay.
and 16 and 17 of Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Love that book.
We're going to explore why we make these, well, kind of predictable errors in judgment
Right.
and how we can use that knowledge to make better decisions in the future.
I love this section of the book. You know, what's really fascinating is how it builds on these concepts of System 1 and System 2 thinking.
Yeah.
And I always like to remind listeners, you know, System 1, that's our fast, intuitive, automatic system.
Right.
While System 2 is slower, more deliberate, more analytical.
More effort.
Takes more effort. Exactly. And these chapters, what I love about them is they just reveal how often System 1 hijacks our decision-making
Yeah.
and leads to honestly, some surprising biases.
Yeah, it's kind of unsettling when you start to realize just how often this is happening.
Totally.
And chapter 9 just jumps right into it, you know, with this idea of substitution,
Okay.
where our brains are basically swapping out these tough questions for easier ones without us even realizing it.
Uh-huh.
It's like when you're trying to decide if a new product is worth investing in.
Right.
But instead of like really digging into the market research, you know, and the financial projections and all that,
Yeah.
you just think, well, I like the person who pitched it, so it must be good.
Yeah, exactly. Classic example of the affect heuristic,
Yeah.
where our emotions are really coloring our judgment.
Yeah.
And the key takeaway here is, you know, just becoming aware of that tendency,
Right.
consciously pausing before you make a decision. So instead of just relying on that gut feeling, asking yourself, what are the objective criteria I should be using to evaluate this?
So let's say I'm aware of this potential bias. How do I actually put this into practice? Like, what can I do differently?
Yeah, well, a really good starting point is to create a checklist. Okay.
Of objective criteria for different types of decisions.
Okay.
So, you know, if you're evaluating an investment opportunity, that checklist might include things like market size, competitive landscape, financial projections, you know, all those things that we should be looking at.
Yeah. I like that.
It kind of takes the emotion out of it.
Right.
And forces you to think more systematically.
Right, exactly.
It's a way to engage that system too, thinking that slower, more analytical part of our brain.
Now, chapter 10 takes aim at this idea of the law of small numbers, which, spoiler alert, is not really a law at all.
Right, exactly. You know, it challenges our tendency to see patterns and jump to conclusions based on really limited data.
Yeah.
And Kahneman, he really emphasizes how easily we can be misled by small samples, especially when they're not truly random.
Yeah. The example he uses about cancer rates in rural counties
Yes.
really brought this home for me.
Oh, because it's so tempting to think, oh, well, those lower rates must be because of, you know, the clean living and the fresh air.
Right.
But statistically, that explanation just doesn't hold up.
It's a perfect example of how, you know, our intuition just wants to create these neat narratives, these causal narratives. But sometimes the truth is a lot messier and more random. And so the takeaway here is to just be skeptical of anyone who's making, you know, these really bold claims based on a really small or, you know, kind of cherry-picked data sets.
Yeah, so whenever someone throws a statistic at you, you know, always ask,
Yeah.
what's the sample size?
Yeah.
Was it a random sample?
Yeah.
Because there's almost always more to the story than meets the eye.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is just so key, especially these days with this, you know, data overload we have.
Yeah. Now, get ready, because Chapter 11 introduces this concept of anchoring.
Ooh, anchoring. Okay.
And this is the idea that the first piece of information that we encounter
Yeah.
can significantly influence all of our subsequent judgments.
It's so powerful.
It's wild. It's like our brains just get stuck on that initial anchor,
Yeah.
even if it's completely arbitrary.
And a little bit unsettling when you think about how easily it can sway our decisions, right?
Yeah, totally.
I mean, Kahneman, he gives that example of real estate pricing
Right.
and how if the first house that you see is listed at, you know, a crazy price, that number becomes an anchor.
Right.
And all the other houses you see
Yeah.
now seem more reasonable in comparison,
Yeah.
even if they're also overpriced.
It's so interesting how that works.
It's crazy.
So what can we do to avoid being manipulated by these anchors?
Well, one strategy is to, first of all, just be aware of potential anchors
Right.
and then actively try to adjust for them.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're negotiating a salary and the employer throws out, a lowball offer,
Right.
don't let that number become your anchor. Do your research.
Right.
Come in with your own counteroffer that's based on, what you're worth and what the market rate is.
It's funny. I'm starting to see a theme here.
What's that?
It seems like a lot of this just comes down to being aware of these biases.
Yeah.
And then consciously engaging that system to thinking, to counteract them.
Exactly. Awareness is really the first step toward making more objective, more informed decisions.
Okay. Let's move on to chapter 12, which dives into the world of availability
Right.
and how we can be swayed by what's readily available in our minds, especially if it's vivid or emotional.
This one is so relevant when you think about, how we consume news and information today.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, the media loves to focus on rare,
Right.
but really dramatic events.
Plane crashes, shark attacks, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Things that just stick with us, right? And because they're so vivid and memorable, they dominate our thinking. And we actually overestimate the likelihood of them happening.
Yeah, it's that classic if it bleeds, it leads phenomenon, right?
Totally.
Like, the more we see something, the more likely we are to believe that it's a common occurrence.
Yeah.
Even if, statistically, it's incredibly rare.
Absolutely.
So how do we break free from the grip of this availability bias?
Well, one strategy is to consciously seek out a wider range of information. So, don't just rely on what's easy, what pops up in your social media feed,
Right.
Look for data and statistics that can help you get a more accurate picture of the situation.
So it's all about challenging our assumptions
Yes.
and actively seeking out evidence, even if it contradicts our initial gut feeling.
And that can be hard, right?
Yeah.
Especially if it's challenging a belief that we've had for a long time,
Right.
but it's essential.
If we want to be grounded in reality.
In reality, exactly.
Now, chapter 13 takes this idea of availability
Yeah.
and connects it to emotions and risk perception.
It highlights how fear and anxiety
Yeah.
can really amplify our perception of certain risks,
Uh-huh.
even if those risks are statistically very low.
Right.
So you think about, after a major terrorist attack,
Okay.
people often become much more fearful
Right.
of being a victim of a terrorist attack, even though statistically the likelihood of that happening is incredibly small.
Yeah, it's like our emotions just completely hijack our rational thinking
Totally.
and make certain dangers feel much more imminent than they actually are.
Exactly. And that can obviously lead to poor decision making. We might avoid certain activities or make life choices based on that fear rather than an accurate assessment of the risks.
Yeah. So how do we avoid letting our emotions completely dictate our risk perception?
It's a balance, right? We don't want to ignore our emotions entirely because they can be very informative,
Right.
but we need to be aware of how they can distort our thinking, especially when it comes to risk. One technique that I find really helpful is to consciously label and acknowledge your emotions.
Okay.
So, just naming the feeling, okay, I'm feeling anxious about this, that can help to create some distance between the emotion
Okay.
and your decision-making process.
So it's acknowledging the role of emotions,
Yeah,
but not letting them completely control us.
exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot, where we can use them to inform our decisions, but not let them control us.
I love that. It's about finding that balance, right, between our intuitive system one
Yeah.
and our more analytical system two.
Absolutely. And that, I think, is the overarching theme of these chapters. It's not about eradicating System 1. That's impossible.
Right.
And honestly, not even desirable.
Right.
System 1, it allows us to make quick decisions,
Right.
navigate our complex world efficiently.
Yeah, we need it.
We do need it. But the key is to understand its limitations. Recognize when it's likely to lead us astray.
Yeah.
And engage System 2
Yeah.
to make more informed choices.
So it's about finding that balance between our two thinking systems. Now, we're going to jump ahead to chapters 16 and 17. We'll explore our brain's love for causal narratives,
Okay.
the statistical phenomenon of regression to the mean,
Uh-huh.
and how these concepts can help us make better sense of our world.
Sounds good.
But first, a word from our sponsors.
Great.
All right, we're back, ready to tackle chapters 16 and 17.
Let's do it.
These chapters explore some pretty intriguing concepts.
Yeah.
Our brain's obsession with, finding causes for everything,
Uh-huh.
and this statistical phenomenon called regression to the mean.
Yeah, they really highlight how our intuition
Yeah.
can sometimes lead us to misinterpret events and draw faulty conclusions.
Yeah. Let's start with chapter 16, Causes Trump Statistics.
Okay.
I have a feeling a lot of listeners will relate to this one.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this chapter really digs into our deep-seated need to find explanations for why things happen.
Right. We want that story.
We want the story. We crave those neat cause and effect narratives, even when the evidence points to a less exciting,
Right.
but more accurate explanation.
Like randomness.
Randomness, exactly.
You know, the librarian versus farmer example that Kahneman uses
Yes.
really illustrates this point.
Such a good example.
I remember reading that and thinking, wow, I totally fell for the stereotype.
It's so easy to do. It's a classic example of how we tend to ignore base rates, you know, the underlying probabilities,
Right.
when we're presented with this vivid story. We're so drawn to those captivating narratives that we often overlook the statistical reality.
So how do we avoid falling into this trap? I mean, we can't just like shut off our desire for explanations, can we?
We can't. No, stories are powerful and they help us make sense of the world.
Yeah.
But the key is to just be aware of this tendency
Okay.
and to balance our narrative-seeking impulses with a healthy dose of statistical thinking.
So it's about like looking at the numbers, considering the base rates,
Yes.
and not just jumping to conclusions based on a good story.
Exactly. Asking, is there another explanation? Perhaps less exciting, but more statistically likely explanation for what happened.
Okay. Now, chapter 17 delves into this concept called regression to the mean,
Yes.
which sounds a bit intimidating, but it's actually incredibly useful
It's a great
for
concept.
understanding patterns and making better predictions.
This chapter explores the statistical tendency for extreme events to regress back towards the average over time.
Right.
What goes up must come down.
I think about that example that Kahneman uses with pilots and their landings.
Oh, yeah.
You know, if a pilot has a really exceptionally smooth landing, they're statistically more likely to have a slightly rougher one next time,
Right.
just due to random variation.
Exactly. And the flip side is true, too, right?
Right.
If a pilot has a rough landing, their next one's probably going to be smoother, regardless of whether they were praised or reprimanded
Yeah.
for that previous performance.
A powerful reminder that we often misinterpret cause and effect.
Totally.
We see a pattern and we assume there must be a causal explanation.
Right. We want to explain it.
But sometimes it's simply the statistical reality of regression to the mean at play.
Totally.
And this has huge implications for how we evaluate performance,
Yeah.
both our own and that of others.
We tend to overreact to those extreme events, right?
Right.
Attributing them to skill or effort, when in reality, randomness might have played a big role.
Yeah. So how do we apply this understanding of regression to the mean in our everyday lives?
Well, one key takeaway is to be cautious about drawing sweeping conclusions from isolated events. Don't assume that one success or failure is indicative of a long-term trend.
Right.
Instead, look for patterns over time.
So it's about taking a more nuanced view of performance,
Yeah.
acknowledging the role of randomness, and not overreacting to those inevitable ups and downs.
Exactly. And when you're evaluating someone's performance, whether it's an employee or a student, even yourself,
Right.
consider the context. Look at the long-term trends. Factor in the possibility that random variation might be influencing the results.
Yeah. Yeah. These chapters really challenge us to question our assumptions
They do.
and look beyond those intuitive but often flawed explanations.
It's about engaging that system 2 thinking,
Yeah.
especially when we're dealing with complex situations or trying to make sense of statistical information.
Right. Finding that balance
Finding that balance.
between our intuition and our more deliberate reasoning processes.
Absolutely.
Now, in our final segment, we'll explore how we can put all these insights into action
Okay.
and make more informed decisions in all areas of our lives. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into thinking fast and slow.
Yeah.
You know, we've explored how our brains use these mental shortcuts and how that leads to these, well, kind of predictable biases in our thinking.
All right.
But what does all this actually mean for us in the real world?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that we're all susceptible to these biases.
Yeah.
No matter how smart or rational we think we are, they're
Yeah.
just part of how our minds work.
So it's not really about, like, eliminating these biases altogether,
Right.
which is probably impossible anyway.
Yeah.
It's more about, like, recognizing them.
Yeah, yeah.
and developing strategies to kind of mitigate their influence. Okay.
Exactly. Awareness is key, right? Once we understand how they operate,
Yeah.
we can start to question our own judgments, our own decisions more effectively. We can learn to pause, engage that system two thinking, consider other perspectives.
So if I'm trying to put all this into practice,
Mm-hmm.
what are some concrete steps I can take, to make more informed decisions?
Well, one thing is to be mindful of the information that you're consuming.
Okay.
Don't just accept headlines or sensationalized stories at face value.
Right.
Remember the law of small numbers.
Yeah.
Be wary of anyone drawing huge conclusions from really limited data.
And when it comes to evaluating risks, it's really crucial to acknowledge the role of emotions, but not let them completely hijack our thinking.
Yeah. I mean, fear and anxiety, they can really amplify our perception of certain risks, make them seem way more imminent than they really are.
Right, right.
So it's important to seek out objective data statistics to really ground our risk assessments in reality, not just our feelings.
Data over drama.
Data over drama.
I like that.
Good mantra.
Yeah. I have to ask, if we're so prone to all these cognitive biases, is it ever possible to make truly objective judgments?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's one that Kahneman kind of grapples with throughout the book.
Right.
I think the answer is that perfect objectivity is probably an unattainable ideal.
Okay.
We're all shaped by our experiences, our beliefs, our own unique biases.
So it's this continuous process of self-awareness and improvement.
Exactly. The more we understand the limitations of our own thinking,
Yeah.
the better we are to make more informed, rational, wiser choices.
This has been a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is, we can't completely eliminate these biases, but we can definitely become more aware of them.
Right.
And, develop those strategies to make more conscious and deliberate decisions.
And by understanding these tendencies, we can make better decisions ourselves,
Yeah.
but also be more discerning consumers of information and just honestly more compassionate towards others who might be falling prey to these same traps.
So well said. And on that note, we'll leave our listeners with this thought. If our memories can distort our perception of risk, as we learned in Chapter 13, how can we make sure we're not letting fear unnecessarily dictate our choices? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.